Hi there everyone, hope you're doing well today. A question I get quite a lot on the Substack is people reaching out and asking what tradition I think they should take part in. Now some are Christians here, some are semi-Christian, some aren't Christians at all, but generically spiritual. And I think all of them share one thing, and that's they've recognized that they need structure in their life, they need a sense of support, they need a deep wisdom that the modern world isn't offering. And perhaps above all else, they need a daily practice, something they can engage in the minutiae of their life that speaks to the eternal. That will orient your life correctly. Now, this is really important when you're on the spiritual path because it's the first admission that I need something more than me. And if modernity is anything, it's the self-centered nature. I think Peter Hitchens once referred to it as selfism. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. We tend to think, I'm the master of my own fate. I don't need anything outside of myself. The great John Lennon song, God, refers to this. Don't believe in tarot, don't believe in Bob Dylan, don't believe in Beatles or Jesus. Just believe in me, Yoko and me. I personally think that that's going to make you ill, that perspective, especially if you align it with a woman. A woman is not going to complete you. We're going to need a richer dynamic than that. So the point is, assuming that you're at that place where you're starting to think, okay, I need something more than my own individual mind. I've realized that's limited and I can't understand the depth of what I am. I can't truly heal myself via my own means. What do I turn to? Well, the first thing I'd say is go easy. This stuff with forming into a tradition or falling into one takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. Many people spend years, myself included. In fact, I'd still say I'm on the search for really, truly bedding in. But I know that over 10 years or so now, you learn more. Year by year, you take on more, you try different things. And I'd advise you do that too. And what you're really looking for is the resonance in your heart. We know when we hear spiritual truth. It's not quite like intellectual truth. Now, of course, this takes time to fine-tune that because, of course, many people can be easily abused with spiritual truth. There's a million examples of that, especially with the New Age thing. It could be some guy who's promising enlightenment and then ends up, trying to just bang the women who go there. And maybe he is half enlightened, but he still wants to bang the women. Now, you do get more of an understanding of this over time. I think this is why I've always been wary of the total New Age scene. Because, there can be real spirituality in there. But when it's divorced from a tradition, it's almost like they're saying, we don't need the morality of the tradition to guide us. We're beyond that, and that can lead to trouble, in my experience. But the point I'm getting at here is give yourself time. Let yourself explore. Ask questions, read books, go to different ceremonies and practices, and see which resonates with you deeply. The most important thing we're looking for here is that which really allows you to challenge the darkness in your own life, because where we face the difficulty, the darkness and the challenge, that's where the growth will be. And whatever you're leaning on there will be what you need. So it's a good way of figuring out, what's going to work for you is by facing the challenges in life. It's also worth saying, I've said this many times, the mainstream church unfortunately can be very ideological on the one side, very political these days, or it can be just lightweight, just really soft. And that's all right, it's fun for the little kids, it's nice for the grandmas to go and have the nice sing songs. But if you're a man who really is looking to truly have that spiritual rebirth, it's quite rare to find that depth in the church. Not impossible, but it is rare. So again, I think it begins with your own spiritual journey and starting to read the great saints, read the great figures, listen to people you're interested in, find out what they do, and emulate that path, when it comes to your own difficulties. And we all have difficulties, whatever yours are, a breakup, a bereavement, an addiction, whatever it is, we all have these things that challenge us. And try and take it on, and try and say, well, what's life, what's God trying to show me with this challenge? Now, how can I grow through it? Because most of the time when we face a challenge in life, it's a test to evolve, spiritually, mentally, and physically. Now, personally speaking, I secular background, atheist family, I didn't have any spiritual experience at all. And my spiritual journey really started with a lot of challenge. The dark night of the soul, drinking a lot, chasing women, chasing worldly success, and hitting the wall. And then realizing, there's a lot of wounds in me, a lot of damage. And I have to go into those and face them and see, well, what is it, that's led to this? And what are these wounds doing to me now? And how do I start to address them? Now, that was a quasi-spiritual experience in and of itself, because again, I realized my own limitations. Now, the first thing I did was embrace a sort of Eckhart Tolle New Age spirituality. And like I say, there's some real guidance in there that can really help. It introduced me to religious teachings that I would have just been completely anti before. But it allowed me to see them in a new way. Maybe this isn't about literal truth. Maybe this is speaking to a higher order of truth, the healing of your soul. That was a way in. I should also add here, be very careful with people who want to yell at you and lecture you. There's a lot of those people around in the spiritual and religious world, and they're all desperate to tell you they're right and why you're wrong. I've never really been able to vibe with people like that. In a way, I think it's just another mind thing. The religion just becomes another thing they cling on to and yell at other people about. But what I'm saying is, what we're looking for is that real spiritual journey. Because that your soul, your heart will really guide you when it feels true resonance. Again, that doesn't mean totally give up the mind. Be aware of the world. There are many snakes out there, and some of them are trying to take you for a ride, and we have to be careful of that. But personally speaking, I embrace the New Age thing, and then, as I gestured towards earlier, I realised a lot of it just seems to end up in sex once you start going a bit deeper, as well as lots of damaged people I felt as well in that world. I mean, doing very good things, trying to turn away from some of their pain, which I can respect, but I think there was also, this almost, if you turn to this spirit, non-duality, whatever they call it, it's almost as if you don't have to take personal responsibility in the world. I felt there was a lot of what's sometimes called spiritual bypassing going on. And I started to explore more and more about going into that pain. Now that led me into Buddhism, because of course Buddhism is all about the end of suffering, nirvana. And we have to acknowledge, what that suffering is. And I enjoyed that for a while, but I felt it was missing something. It was wonderful on the spiritual level, but in the practical day-to-day level, I was finding, this isn't quite answering the questions I need. It's not fully guiding me. And bit by bit, I was thinking, oh no, I'm not a Christian, am I? And it turns out I pretty much was. And of course, I very much welcome that now. But back then, I was still very much in the kind of millennial mindset. Ricky Gervais, Richard Dawkins, isn't it all stupid, And Christianity is just grandma's drinking tea, isn't it? And, conservatives who are telling you off for touching your winky. So I thought, surely can't be me. But I started to realise over time it was like a pincer movement. The spirit on one side and on the other side, the practical discipline, the direction. I've spoken about this before, love and discipline. Those two forces combined are heavenly for men. We really need those. A lot of men are all right with discipline, but they don't like love for understandable reasons. It's been very feminised in this day and age. Or you get the more New Age guys who'll be all right with the love, but they don't like the discipline. They'll call that ego or toxic. In my experience, the Christian path is the beautiful unity of both that really heals our soul. Now, that led me to Christian mysticism, which is what I'm broadly at to this day. Initiation, both masculine and spiritual. And that would mean that a lot of my understandings are outside of the mainstream church. I will happily go to a church. There are bits I can vibe with, there are bits that I can't. But the mainstream church, with the happy clappy stuff, isn't going to be for me. I don't hate them. I wish them well. I just know what I'm interested in is the birth, the death, the rebirth, and all these sorts of things. It's also why, in the video I did of my working space in the Substack the other day, I have a Buddha statue up on my little spiritual shelf where I have a lot of holy books, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and of course lots of Bibles. Now, again, a lot of people say, oh, how dare you, that's sacrilege. I just don't view it that way. These are just other attempts to understand the divine. I go with the Christian path myself. I believe that's consistent with my background, my history, and the roots of the Western world, as well as offering a path to the divine. But I have that statue of the Buddha in a way as thanks for introducing me to the light of God. I think it was Emmett Fox who had a lovely phrase about the light of Asia gives way to the light of the world. I also read quite a lot from Thich Nhat Hanh and Thomas Merton, a Zen master and a Catholic monk. They had a really nice interaction. It really helped me learn about, the spiritual side of Christianity. But anyway, as I'm saying, what I'm drawn to largely is the mysticism, which can often challenge the mainstream tradition. Mainstream Christians wouldn't really like me. They'd say, don't listen to me, and by all means, feel free not to. And by all means, don't take what I say seriously. Go and find out what you think is true. I think that's the only way. Other people can only point the finger. It's your heart and soul that'll find the way for yourself. But perhaps unlike some people who are drawn to the mystic line, I've always believed tradition is really important. One, for the discipline I mentioned earlier, but two, I think it's vital for a civilization and a society. And to be blunt, some people aren't drawn to the mystic path, to the death and the rebirth, and they don't have to be. It tends to be a minority. That's why I know on this channel the subs will be a lot lower than when I'm speaking about worldly things, because most people are interested in the worldly, and that's all right. But there always are those people who want to go that bit deeper, who want answers right at the pit of their soul, who want to find God. Now, with those people, they often act as the figures who bring forth the spiritual messaging. Now, I'm not claiming to be that, but there've certainly been prophets throughout time that have done that. There could be the insights straight from the heart of love. Things like, love your neighbour and so on. Or the boundaries around marriage and sex. Now, they become institutionalised in the tradition. And they might get very often corrupted by the tradition too. But if we chart their roots back far enough, we'll find they do have a deeper resonance beyond the egocentrism of the individual self. Perhaps that's my most unique point I'm trying to make on both channels, really, is that there is space for the mysticism and the tradition, and they can work together. Now, I'm just going to end by speaking about the different Christian traditions, because I know this can be a bit complex for some people when you're starting afresh. And as a quick overview, you may hear a lot today about trad Christianity. And what people mean when they say that most often is Catholicism or Orthodoxy. Now, the reason being is Catholicism and Orthodoxy are the oldest of the churches. They would both say they're the original church, upon which Christ built the church on Peter. Now, they have a disagreement. They had a schism around 1,000 years ago. So they have a bit of a disagreement as to who really is the original church. But as you probably know, the Catholic Church, rooted in the Vatican, more Western, and the Orthodox, more Eastern. Now, that has had an influence on how they've developed. The Western Catholic Church has leaned more towards philosophy, the sciences, and so on. And the Orthodox Church does tend to keep more of a disciplinarian and mystic tone to it. If I'm honest, I'm slightly drawn to the Orthodox Church for that reason, although I do have massive respect for the Catholic Church. Now, this is why a lot of people today are harking back to these two, because in modernity they're saying, well, I need something which is old, older than the Industrial Revolution, that goes right back to the beginning. I want to find roots. So they often will go to those movements, but when they go, maybe it might be a bit full on for them. Another issue is you can argue the Catholic Church especially has liberalised a lot in recent years. So they go there and find more worldliness, another lecture on, why being trans is great or whatever. To be fair, I'm obviously being over the top there. The Catholic Church is not nearly as bad as some of the Protestant churches, which we'll get onto. But in principle, that can be an issue. Now, of course, the criticism of the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, but the Catholic Church especially in the Western world, is it's too dogmatic. It controls what people think. And they have this hierarchy which stops people having direct relationships with the divine, with God. And we could chart this back to Martin Luther, famously nailed his 95 Thesis onto the door of a church in Germany. Can't remember exactly where. Do let me know in the comments. And that really began the Protestant Revolution, obviously a protestant. Now, that developed very much in Northern Europe. So, Scandinavia, Northern Germany, UK, and so on. And one of the beautiful things about it is it has promoted this direct relationship with God. You don't need great bishops and you don't need to attend a 2-hour mass. You can go right here and pray to God and have a mystical experience here and now. And there are lots of great mystics, in the English tradition, in the Protestant tradition too. Especially in America, actually. They tend to veer a bit on the material side. Typical Americanisms, as you can imagine, the whole, God's going to give me a Ferrari and make me rich. They call that prosperity gospel stuff. Now, I'm a bit wary of that. I don't think it's wrong to have money, but I don't think that's the point of life necessarily. But anyway, the point that I'm getting at here is that was why Protestantism really took off. But there's been a massive, massive downside to this. And this is that it's taken away, you might say, the spiritual master and the role of the hierarchy. So in one sense, it's great that people can now have open meditation, open prayer, open connection with God. But the downside is all of a sudden everybody thinks they're the second coming of Jesus, and their Protestant domination, which is increasingly niche, is the right one. And I think there's something like 39,000 Protestant denominations now, which gives you an idea of how messy it's got. And they range everything from the hardcore conservative Bible Belt American who hates gays and, the kind of cliche KKK, whatever. And then on the flip side, you have the exact opposite, the New York or Shoreditch in London, trendy, LGBTQ, big fat lesbian pastor, gay flag tattooed on their head, only does lesbian weddings, thinks whites are toxic, that sort of thing. And this is a massive issue with Protestantism, and it's getting to the point where almost Scripture is completely ignored. Whereas on one side, they call it sola scriptura of Protestantism, all they'll look at is Scripture. And then on the other side, Scripture is completely forgotten, and it's just simple. Well, it's vibes basically. Feeling good, meditation. Jesus was a hippie and gay, all this sort of stuff. And you can see the problem when you lose that central order. Things get messy, and it's just a free for all. Now, I'm going to get a little deep here. I'm only going to pay lip service to this, but there's also arguments which I think are true that Protestantism also led to the. You could say the philosophical revolution of modernity. What I mean by that is the idea that everything needs to be critiqued, everything is material, it's pushed away the tradition and the mystic. And there are even people saying that Richard Dawkins, is an example of a Protestant Puritan. That's really the intellectual and even spiritual tradition he's from. I know he'd reject that, obviously, but it's a very Anglo-Protestantist messaging he has. Very scientific, very materialistic, very critical. Tell me what's true here and now and practical. So again, this is why it's very difficult to fall into a Protestant tradition in a big way. I mean, Russell Brand recently became Christian. He's become some variation of Protestant. And as you can see, probably one of the reasons for that is he can go and baptise people in the Thames, which he's doing. And you can see a guy like that is probably really fond of that. Straight away, I'm a Christian and I'm doing it for real. In the trad churches, the Orthodox and the Catholic, you wouldn't be able to do that. You're going to have to spend a long time as an initiate, a catechumen, and then you will, at Easter, become accepted into that tradition. And still then, you're going to have to take your time, you're going to have to learn and so on. And the demands on you are much higher. Things such as your personal behaviour and so on. So this is a rough outline as to what's gone on in the Christian church, and a lot of it's messy. And I would personally have a lot of sympathy for people who are erring towards the Catholic and the Orthodox, because the Protestant has just become too haphazard. Everyone disagrees on everything. Some people just think, basic Christian rules don't matter. The whole lot, it doesn't matter how many girlfriends you have, all this sort of stuff, just let loose, do whatever you want, and as long as you come and pray and say, I love Jesus, it's all gravy. You can see the problem with that on a societal level. So what I'm saying, this isn't so you decide on one now, it's so you understand what these are and what they demand. And it's my belief that you can't really force the discipline of a tradition on someone. If you do that, people will reject it and they will resent it. In my experience, you have to welcome the tradition yourself. You have to want to engage in Lent. You have to want to not eat meat on that day. You have to want to spend a Friday in contemplation about the sacrifice of Christ. And you have to do that because you realize without it, your lower self, your worldly self comes through and makes you sick. And by extension, that makes the world sick. So I'm not saying I have all the answers here. In fact, I feel that we're at a moment in history, where we're in the wilderness, as Westerners, and we need to be in the wilderness in order to find ourselves. But your spiritual journey is vital. And that's why I celebrate and advise you to follow your heart, follow the great teachers, ask questions, engage with the different traditions, and find where the truth is. Because I believe in the next generations, men like that are going to be sorely needed to guide what will be an even more lost and pained generation. So I hope this helped, and do let me know if I can answer any more of your questions. I've got a few more written down to get to in the coming days and weeks. If you want to connect with me, do join the Substack. Other than that, God bless, and I'll see you again soon.